so we can have this for reference later in your certified library. And we will get started. So I'm just going to share my desktop with everyone. All right, as I mentioned today, we are talking about well-being patterns. And just as we tend to, I want to center us by bringing us back to this quote that we often visit. Every human being is like every other human being, like some other human beings, and like no other human beings. We're going to be, as always, talking about kind of all these different levels today. The first one being that we all have well-being patterns. How we express those well-being patterns is certainly informed by sort of the subgroups and subcultures that we're around and part of. And then, of course, a lot of the expression of that comes down to some of my very unique individual differences way underneath the surface that make me unique to who I am and like no other person. So it's always important to be thinking about those three different levels to understand the full complexity of humans. So kind of want to set the stage and back up a little bit. So we're talking about what we call personality patterns, and just a little bit of clarity on this. So in your desk reference, starting on page 189 of the second edition, that's what I'm working from at least today, the second edition, starting on page 189 and then going for several pages, is where these personality patterns are referenced. When we're talking about personality patterns, what we're really talking about is something that is really almost established outside of WSQ-Discovery, outside of Care Profiler. This is really established research that's done all over the place, all over the world. It's kind of deeply referenced into the literature in terms of just looking at those big five factors. So openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and emotionality or neuroticism. And kind of looking at different combinations of those and how some of those combinations might relate to patterns of behaviors, interests, things of that nature. In the second version of the desk reference, we've listed a few different personality patterns. We've talked about defense patterns. Today, we're going to be talking about the category of well-being patterns. What I want to try to make clear is that the content in there is really intended for certified folks to help in kind of their conceptualization of understanding the people that they're working with. So personality patterns are not going to be referenced in any reports that you give people. This isn't language that we would necessarily share with a client directly, but it's really to help our understanding, our conceptualization of understanding who is this person and how can I gain more insight knowing a few things about them that can help me help them be more successful. So again, personality patterns really to be used to help you in your understanding, your conceptualization of who this person might be. And so the one that we're focusing on today is well-being patterns. A well-being pattern really just kind of is helping give some insight or some descriptive insight into the general sense of the internal emotional world of a person. That's important because it gives us some insight into, how, again, in general, they might tend to be making emotional meaning out of their own situation that they're in, kind of in the moment. And it's important because how we make meaning, how we interpret situations has a huge impact on a lot of things, but to kind of narrow it down to what we often talk about, certainly on our significance, which is who I am matters, and on our sense of purpose, which is what I'm doing matters. And so how we're interpreting our current moment, whether it's the relationships or the situation around us, the work I'm doing, we often will make meaning of that based on our emotional experience of it, or we will contribute some of the meaning to a portion of our emotional experience. So much of the human experience is based on a felt sense of what I'm experiencing in my body. And that's what these well-being patterns give us insight into, is what that might typically be for a particular individual. So we're going to talk about some of these different combinations and what some of the different kind of research-based established well-being patterns are, all the while knowing that today in these patterns, we're talking at kind of a categorical level. So it's a high level. We aren't getting into the individual differences, right? So, of course, within these 4 different patterns, there's going to be a lot of space and variance for how that might look different for a lot of people. So someone might fit into that category, but what that means, how it's expressed, how it comes to fruition, the degree to which it's expressed is going to look very different depending upon the particular individual. And I'll give you a sense of that as we look at some examples here. So what are the factors? Remember the personality patterns that we're talking about. These are just based on the big 5 factors. So if you remember that acronym of OCEAN, we're just looking at those 5 factors. The 2 factors that contribute to understanding a well-being pattern for an individual are extroversion. And remember, extroversion, kind of on that extroversion-introversion scale, really thinking about where an individual tends to orient themselves in order to try to gain energy, right? So if you're more on the extroverted side, you're going to orient yourselves externally onto the world to try to gain energy. If you're more on the introverted side of that scale, you're going to orient yourself internally to try to gain energy. So that's a contributing factor, is the extroversion scale. The other factor relating to the well-being patterns then is the emotionality scale or / neuroticism. And really that's, again, that access to the emotional experience, one's emotional world. The higher one is on emotionality, the more access to their emotional world that they have, the lower, sort of the less access that they might have to that emotional experience. And so as we're thinking about this, then we combine those 2 factors, 2 scales. On the left, on the vertical there, you see extroversion then. So if someone's higher on here, they're going to be higher on extroversion. The lower they are on extroversion. Said another way, the higher they might be on introversion. And then the horizontal, we have emotionality. So the higher someone is on emotionality, the more that they'd be over on this side of the world. The lower they'd be on this side of the world. What I want to do is just step away from the PowerPoint for just a moment, because I have a couple facilitator reports that I wanted to show just to kind of illustrate where this information would be coming from. So if you're looking at a facilitator report, page 4 of that is where we have the big 5 factors. So here we have openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and emotionality. The 2 factors that we're looking at when we're thinking about well-being patterns would be extroversion, and this person is on the 56th percentile toward extroversion, and then emotionality. This person is the 59th percentile actually away from emotionality toward control. So they're a little bit on the lower side, right? So what's interesting here, though, is that for the most part, both on extroversion and emotionality, this person is kind of generally in the middle, right? Whereas if we look at, I have another report up here. Here's another example. So here we see someone on extroversion is extremely low on introversion, meaning that they're extremely high on introversion, very high. So the 96th percentile on introversion, right? So they would score very low on that extroversion side. And then also extremely high on the emotionality, or at least fairly high on emotionality. So when we're thinking again about those individual differences, and if we were to plot these two people, I'll pull it back up here. If we were to plot, these two people, right? So the one person kind of in the middle on both scales. So on extroversion, they're kind of in the middle. On emotionality, they're kind of in the middle. So they kind of land in the middle. One thing that tells us, they probably don't have an extremely prominent or strong well-being pattern, in that they might kind of fluctuate and demonstrate a little bit of each of these. Whereas that second person was pretty high on emotionality, so they'd end up over here somewhere, and extremely low on extroversion, right? So they're going to definitely have a pretty strong leaning in this pessimist bucket, meaning that they're not likely to access much of the way of the opposite end of the spectrum here, which would be the optimist bucket, right? So that's where, again, kind of some of those individual differences give a sense of the strengths in terms of the preferences and what some of those behaviors might look like. So those are the two scales that we'll be looking at. And then, of course, to gain a little bit, I'm going to end this one more time and go back to those reports, to gain a little bit more insight into even deeper what the individual differences might be like. We can go to the next page and look at their subscales around extroversion, which would be these four. And we can see, right, that this person's really high on the solitude piece, so they're not loving groups of people. So that's going to be a way that this particular scale informs the well-being pattern. And then if we look at their subscales on the emotionality factor, again, we see that their highest scale in emotionality is the intensity piece. So there is some emotional intensity there, but there's some pretty low pieces that are pulling it in the other direction. So again, it just kind of gives a flavor of what are some of the underpinnings of this person's particular emotionality and particular extroversion. All right, so let's go back and now get in the weeds on what some of these styles or patterns look like. So there's four you can see here: optimist, emotional, stoic, pessimist. Again, the language, just kind of a shorthand to kind of for your own internal thinking. You wouldn't necessarily tell someone who's high on emotionality and low on extroversion that their well-being pattern is to be a pessimist, right? That's maybe not the most helpful thing in the world. So it's just kind of language that we put on it internally to have some sense of kind of a shorthand of where someone might be at. So let's take each of these apart. The first one we'll begin with would be someone who's on the low end of extroversion, meaning high introversion, and then the low end of emotionality or high controlled. The kind of accepted label for that, if you will, is stoic, right? So this is someone who's pretty internal, right? So they're low on extroversion, and they don't necessarily naturally have a lot of access to their emotional experience, right? They're not necessarily naturally tapped into that. And so they're generally not emotionally impacted probably in many situations unless they really practice it and try to access that kind of information. They're not probably someone who's likely to experience extreme emotional states. And because of that, therefore, they're not likely to probably make very impulsive decisions or decisions that are sort of based on their emotion of the moment. So how do we turn that into some meaning making, right? So someone who is sort of has a stoic well-being pattern, and we think about how might that influence how they're making meaning out of a situation. Well, of course, we can't ever know with 100% certainty, but some hypotheses that we might have is that they actually don't use a lot of emotional information to make meaning out of situations, right? And remember, there's always going to be some good things about some natural tendencies and maybe some things that get in the way. So some of the positive pieces of a more stoic type of well-being pattern is that you aren't perhaps overly influenced by your emotional state, right? So, if you're maybe experiencing some kind of negative emotion, that might be, you might be more inclined to make a negative meaning out of the situation. Well, that's maybe not the case for a stoic person because they're not necessarily tapping into that emotional experience too much. On the flip side, they're missing a lot of information, right? So the meaning making might not even be happening as much as we might want them to, right? So finding that significance, finding that purpose, the challenge for someone with this kind of pattern is going to be figuring out what that is without some of that felt sense in the body, which can just make it a little bit more unnatural, a little bit more out of reach at times, right? And so kind of helping them connect to, what is this really like for you? It might take a bit longer for them to get to that sense of meaning. So that's the stoic kind of style. Next one then, if we were to increase emotionality, so someone with a high factor of emotionality, but still on the lower side of extroversion, sort of the perhaps unfortunate label again for this would be what we classify as maybe a pessimist. Now this is someone who, again, particularly on the extreme side, has a lot of access to their emotional experience, right? All the negative, all the positive, all the messy stuff, and they're feeling that. They're definitely experiencing that. However, their kind of low extroversion or their high introversion means that they're probably turning a lot of that internal, right? So they're taking it all on, they're sitting with it, maybe ruminating with it, and the intensity of all that emotion becomes internalized. And you can see how, particularly for the negative emotion, how that could very much turn into making meaning about a situation that maybe isn't very positive, right? And so helping folks who might tend to have this combination of factors really kind of work through that emotion and actually get it outside of themselves so that they can maybe find a little bit more clarity around the situation would be probably a helpful thing. All right, moving around the bend then, so we're in the far right corner. So this would be someone who's both high on emotionality and high on extroversion, right? So they have a lot of access to their full range of emotional experiences. And they're also oriented to the external world. So they're acting on it, they're putting energy out into it. There's kind of a higher sense of energy with this particular pattern. You can kind of feel it. It's often kind of emanating from folks who might fall into this category. And because that emotional sense is so strong and there's a lot of energy going out, there might be kind of a rapid fluctuation from in and out of different emotional states, and they're likely to be sharing that with others, right? Because there's that externalizing piece. And so, one sort of descriptive piece of someone who might have a well-being pattern in this emotional category, and if we think about how they're then maybe making meaning of their situation, is that it's kind of constantly fluctuating, right? Because they're really kind of living into that emotion. How I feel right now, I might feel different an hour from now. And so the meaning making, it's probably pretty rapid and changing kind of rapidly, and right. So kind of helping this person in their meaning making around significance and purpose would actually be maybe slowing down some of that energy and kind of bringing awareness to the moment and the here and now, and kind of almost an education piece on emotional states might change, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the meaning about the situation actually changes as often as our emotional state does. All right, the final pattern here, the well-being pattern, again has this almost opposite value-laden label from the pessimist. This is the optimist. Don't read too much into the labels. So this is someone who would be high on extroversion, right? So putting energy out into the world in order to try to get energy. And then, but lower on the emotionality. So maybe not as much access to the emotional experience, a little bit more controlled. And so just as we see here, this type of category would suggest someone who maybe doesn't have access to their full range of emotional experience, at least naturally. Of course, everyone can learn to find it. But, they might not always have a clear picture of what's really going on because they're not maybe tapping into that emotional knowledge about themselves or about what they might be having about a situation. What the research shows is that folks who tend to have this combination of factors, high extroversion, low emotionality, have a bias toward making positive meaning. Now, on the surface, we might say, hey, that sounds great, and sure, there's a good thing about that, I suppose. The thing to be cautious about is that they might not always be looking at things realistically, right, and actually recognizing or acknowledging the issue or the trouble or the negative component of the situation. And so sometimes it's helping folks access sort of the reality of that sometimes things aren't great and that's okay, is kind of often something to be working with on the optimist type of well-being pattern. So those are the 4 well-being patterns. Again, kind of want to reiterate, these are kind of high-level ways of thinking about how extroversion interacts with emotionality and how that can have some impact on the kind of default meaning that someone might be making out of a situation. Again, this language isn't necessarily something that you would share with someone, but the concepts are certainly something that you can share. And of course, in general with assessment, what we're trying to help people do is increase their level of self-awareness. And so kind of one goal with this would be to help someone understand their extroversion and their emotionality, how those two interact, and how that might be informing how they're interpreting a situation, how they're making meaning out of a situation. Of course, it's always better to help walk someone there rather than just tell them. So what we have here are just kind of some typical questions and reflections that could be helpful around this kind of idea of helping someone come to see, grow in their awareness of how their extroversion and emotionality is interacting to help inform the kind of meaning that they're making. So some of the questions, you might ask to bring some of this to the surface, and of course these aren't in any particular order, just kind of random questions here, but what kind of meaning are you making about this situation, right? So just ask the question, because it's such a good question to kind of always be considering, because we're always making meaning out of every moment, right? What does this mean for me? And to be aware of and to increase our awareness of what is the meaning that I'm making out of this. Am I making meaning about who I am? Am I making meaning about the value that I have or don't have? Am I making meaning about other people? Am I making meaning about this place? There's always things that we're making meaning of. And so to help someone draw conclusions or even be curious about what is driving that. And then to try to help them see the other side, what might I be missing as I think about this situation, right? So for those stoic folks, maybe I'm missing some of the emotional information because I don't naturally access that. Or maybe I'm missing some of the things that are actually happening around me because I'm so internally focused. And then, of course, vice versa. So questions are good, and then of course some reflections. So questions and reflections work hand in hand, and from my perspective, they're basically the same thing. Question, of course, is an inquiry. A reflection is a statement, but it works in the same way as a question to kind of get someone thinking, right? So seems like that might be a consistent pattern of thinking for you. So after you've inquired about what kind of meaning someone might be making about the situation, you might reflect back and say, well, it seems like that might be a way that you're thinking of a lot of things. Oh, yeah, I had thought about it that way. Right? You really access and use your emotional experience a lot. And again, these aren't judgment statements. They're just observations to help people explore, there's good things about that, and maybe there's not so helpful things about that. And then, of course, the opposite, maybe you don't access your emotional experience very much. Just little things to nudge people and help them process through and think through their experiences and how they're making meaning of things. So that is our kind of quick dive into the personality pattern of well-being patterns, looking at the factor of extroversion and the factor of emotionality. As always, this is recorded, so you can access this for future reference in your certified member library in your dashboard. And we will look forward to connecting next month in our next third Thursday. But for now, everyone have a great rest of the day, and we'll talk to you soon.